Hugh Despenser the younger didn't die. The way most men do. His execution wasn't a verdict, it was a ritual. What happened to him in 1326 wasn't simply punishment. For treason it was a deliberate eraser of a man's body, identity and legacy, designed to echo across time like a curse whispered beneath a crown he held. No royal title yet. In the final years of Edward II's reign, Despenser ruled England in everything but name. He was the king's shadow, omnipresent, untouchable and deeply resented. His crimes officially treason, sodomy, corruption, but the truth was more dangerous. Hugh wasn't executed because he broke the law, he was executed because he had become the law. When he was finally captured, there was no trial, just a performance. Shackled in iron, the same chains he'd once fastened on his enemies, he was paraded through the streets to the jeers of a nation he helped strangle. His fall wasn't a collapse, it was a spectacle, and to understand why an entire kingdom cheered as his insides were torn from his still living body, we must return to a crumbling throne, a queen silenced too long, and a man who reached too high to the untrained eye. Hugh Despenser the younger appeared unremarkable, a nobleman by birth, son of a royal servant, husband to the king's niece. His pedigree was respectable but not extraordinary. Yet beneath the polished manners and courtly charm lay something more volatile, unchecked ambition fused with calculated intelligence and a total absence of moral restraint. He wasn't born to greatness, he clawed his way to it. By the early 1320s England was already bleeding. King Edward II was weak, often indecisive, and viewed with thinly veiled contempt by his barons. The court was drowning in factionalism and paranoia, and into that chaos stepped Hugh, not as a voice of reason but as its master manipulator. Despenser didn't merely advise Edward, he absorbed him land titles, legal immunity. He claimed them all, not with swords but with schemes. He exiled rivals, seized inheritances, weaponized royal authority for personal gain. Under his shadow the monarchy became a private engine of vengeance. Power was no longer about ruling the kingdom, it was about owning it, and Hugh had no intention of sharing with every passing year. Despenser tightened his grip. He didn't just govern, he consumed the machinery of the state. He intercepted foreign correspondence, penned the king's decrees, and shaped royal policy to suit his ambitions. Parliament, once a voice of council, became a hollow formality. Edward II the monarch was reduced to a figurehead. His authority drained, his court hijacked those who dared speak against Despenser. Vanished, some were jailed, others executed, many simply disappeared. His violence wasn't chaotic, it was strategic. Each blow served a purpose, to show that resistance wasn't punished, it was obliterated. Even Queen Isabella, once loyal to her husband, found herself silenced and humiliated. Her household dismantled, her children used as pawns. The woman who once sat beside the crown was now a ghost in her own court, and at the center of it all stood Hugh, not as an advisor but as an apex predator. His lust for power had become something greater than survival. He didn't want to rule behind the king, he wanted to live forever in song, in scroll, in sacred prayer. But power feeds on illusion, and the deeper he carved himself into the throne, the more enemies he summoned from the shadows. By 1325, England was unraveling, crops failed, taxes soared, nobles whispered in back rooms their loyalty to the crown, replaced by dread. The common folk starved while Despenser grew fat on confiscated lands and stolen wealth. Even Parliament found itself locked out of Power suffocated by the absolute reach of one man, but it wasn't the starving peasants or mutinous barons who triggered Hugh's downfall. It was the Queen Isabella of France, once a loyal royal consort, had suffered a decade of humiliation. Her dignity stripped, her voice silenced, her role reduced to that of a pawn in Hugh's game. But Despenser had underestimated her, and she would become his reckoning. Sent to France on a diplomatic mission, Isabella never returned, instead in exile. She forged a rebellion at her side. Roger Mortimer, a nobleman once imprisoned by Hugh, now her ally, and it was whispered, her lover. Together they raised an army, not from peasants but from mercenaries and disillusioned nobles. They didn't march on England to dethrone the king. Not yet. Their target was Hugh Despenser. And as their ships landed in towns surrendered, something unthinkable happened. No one defended the king's favorite. His name had become poison. The rebellion of 1326 didn't ignite with fire, it spread in silence. Towns opened their gates, nobles switched allegiance without a fight. Even long time loyalists turned their backs. Despenser, once feared across the realm, now stood utterly alone. His power hadn't just slipped, it evaporated. Edward II and Hugh fled like fugitives, stripped of armies, resources and dignity. There were no final stands, no loyal legions, just desperation. At last Hugh was captured, not on a battlefield but in disguise, filthy and skeletal, hiding in a monastery, dressed in a monk's robe, begging sanctuary. He would never be granted. He was dragged out, bound in chains, jeered by the same people who had once bowed to him. Bonfires lit up the night in London. Bells rang. The kingdom exhaled, not with relief but with vengeance. But what awaited Despenser was not a trial. Isabella and Mortimer didn't seek legal closure, they sought a warning, a message written not in parchment but in flesh. He wouldn't be punished like a man, he would be unmade like a curse. When Hugh Despenser was finally seized in October 1326, he was barely a shadow of the man who once ruled from behind the throne. Starving, unwashed, trembling, his downfall wasn't just military, it was symbolic. Gone were his silks and courtiers, now show clearly against the dark wood. It was a stage, and Hugh Despenser was dragged in chains like livestock, locked in the very cages he once filled with enemies. His death didn't begin with execution, it began with humiliation. He was paraded through towns, displayed as a broken relic of tyranny. His beard was shaved, a gesture meant to emasculate. His garments were torn away, replaced with a coarse tunic that exposed his skeletal form. He was tied backward on a horse, facing the tail, a final act of mockery that turned him into a spectacle. Not a prisoner, chroniclers say he wept openly, that he vomited when he heard what was planned. This was no court of law, it was a staged descent into madness. At Hereford, Isabella's temporary seat of power, nobles gathered not for justice, but to witness the reckoning. There was no jury, no evidence, just a list of theatrical charges: treason, sodomy, theft, sorcery, and then the sentence was read aloud. Death was only the beginning. The execution scaffold was no ordinary platform, it was taller, broader, built to be seen, soaked in pitch, so blood would main act in a performance of pure vengeance. They began not with the blade, but with a rope. Hugh was hanged, but not to kill, just enough to make him choke, flail and dangle at the edge of unconsciousness. Then they cut him down, gasping and convulsing, and laid him on the platform. For what was still to come, the knives followed. First his genitals were sliced off, held aloft like trophies, then Thrown into the flames before his fading eyes, a gesture of symbolic erasure. Destruction of legacy, of masculinity, of lineage. The crowd screamed, some with approval, others in horror, but none looked away. Next the executioner opened his abdomen slowly, inch by inch. His intestines were drawn out, still warm, still pulsing, and cast into the same fire. He remained alive for much of it, his consciousness flickering, his eyes reportedly locking on to Queen Isabella. Not in plea but in disbelief. This wasn't execution, it was political obliteration, performed in open daylight. Even as Hugh Despenser lay eviscerated, his death was not allowed to come swiftly. The executioner wasn't rushed, he was meticulous. After the disembowelment, the chest was split open with a hatchet, ribs cracked. One by one, the heart, possibly still beating faintly, was cut out and burned, a final blow not just to the body but to the myth of his invincibility. Only then was he allowed to die, but the sentence hadn't ended. The body was not buried, it was taken apart. His limbs, arms, legs, hands, feet were sawed off and wrapped in cloth. Each was sent to a different corner of the realm. York, Bristol, Northampton, cities where his name once ruled, now received his flesh as a warning, nailed to gates and walls. His head, crowned with dried blood and twisted agony, was mounted on a spike at top London Bridge, the capital's gate. Pilgrims, merchants, nobles all passed beneath it. It wasn't just a display, it was state propaganda, a message carved into skin and bone. Power seized without restraint would be repaid in fire and iron. There was no tomb, no prayers, no forgiveness, only silence and fragments scattered like a disease. The kingdom refused to let rise again as Despenser's limbs were nailed across England. Edward, to the king he once served and controlled, sat silent. His crown was gone, his army disbanded, captured shortly after Hugh's execution. Edward offered no resistance, no defiance, just silence and defeat. The man who once ruled an empire had become a shadow, muttering Despenser's name in the dark, like a prayer to something already lost. Queen Isabella didn't execute him, she did something worse. She made him irrelevant. In a bloodless but humiliating coup, Edward was forced to abdicate the throne, not to Isabella but to his teenage son, Edward III. The transfer of power was cold, public, and carefully staged. Edward wasn't even present. He surrendered the crown from a prison cell, stripped of dignity and surrounded by guards. What followed is one of medieval England's great mysteries. In September 1327, less than a year after Despenser's death, Edward II was found dead officially. Natural illness unofficially. Whispers of a red-hot poker screams behind stone walls. A body too mutilated to show whether legend or truth. One thing is certain, his death was as quiet as Despenser's was loud, and with it a dynasty of decadence and control came to a whispering, shamed end. Hugh Despenser's body had been torn to pieces, his flesh scattered across the kingdom, but his real execution began after death. His enemies didn't want a corpse, they wanted silence. Royal scribes were ordered to erase his name from records. Titles were annulled, seals destroyed, monks scraped his name from manuscripts and chronicles. Where he once loomed were scrubbed clean. Portraits of Edward II were repainted, Despenser's figure removed like a stain. Even family trees were rewritten to forget him. No prayers were spoken, no tomb was built, not even his sins were allowed to endure. Despenser wasn't buried, he was deleted, but history resists deletion. Centuries later, fragments resurfaced, monks hidden, scribbles, faint names under scraped parchment, foreign diplomats who recorded The execution with morbid awe. Slowly the outline of the man returned, not as a villain or martyr but as a warning. Because Despenser wasn't just a tyrant. He was a reflection of a kingdom rotting from within, where favoritism replaced law and cruelty became governance. His fate was a mirror turned toward the future to show what happens when ambition outruns restraint. England didn't just destroy Hugh Despenser, it carved its sins into his bones and scattered them so no one could forget.